So Mars in the fifth house. 8 out of 10 times you'll be watching this video because you have it. And so you're sort of anxious to know whether it's good or bad. If it's okay with you, I will ask you to suspend that concern for the next 10 minutes, just until you get towards the end of the video. Because you can't really understand Mars in the fifth house unless you're not scared of whether or not it's good or bad. And the reason why you don't need to be scared of whether or not it's good or bad is not because there's no such thing as good or bad or any of that kind of stuff. It's because the goodness or the badness of a placement like Mars in the fifth house happens as a result of how the theoretical interpretation permutates as a result of the context that it sits in. So what we'll do in this video, first of all, is explain the theory behind how to interpret Mars in the fifth house. And then we'll look at it in a few real charts to see how the theory permutates into specific instances. So first, let's understand what the fifth house represents. Here's what it literally is. It's the western side of the underground quadrant of sky. Since it's underground, it represents internal things like ideas and feelings. And since it's to the west, it represents interaction with other people. So altogether, the fifth house represents how we exchange feelings and ideas with others. This is why it's the house of intelligence, because intelligence means how well we comprehend what's out there and comprehend what other people are saying and doing. It's also the house of compassion or sympathy, because that means the ability to feel what others are feeling. And therefore it's the house of love, which means being concerned or motivated by what other people feel. Conversely, it's the house of communication, which is converse because it's about how you can make other people understand what you're feeling and thinking. So it has to do with language, symbols, and all sorts of language formats, even numbers and so forth. It's the house of expression, how well you express yourself, which can also mean how beautifully you express yourself. So it has a lot to do with art and creativity. And the ultimate creativity is to produce a living thing. And that's also the most literal meaning of having something inside you, the underground sky, come out and become another being, the west. So it's the house of childbirth and children. Now let us try to understand Mars in the same way. The underlying root of everything that Mars symbolizes is the fact that it basically symbolizes masculinity. Masculinity has two key aspects to it. One is independence, and the other is inception. So Mars is the planet that signifies individuality, independence, and freedom. That's why it represents self-reliance, self-sufficiency. That's why it represents strength and all the things that give us strength. So not only the muscle, but also the weapons that extend the power of those muscles, or the tools, or the machines, or the technologies. And Mars represents conflict, because that's what happens when you have strength that is individualistic or independent. So it has to do with conflict, contests, competitions, violence, war. Masculinity is also inceptive, so that means Mars represents initiative, getting things started, and wanting to do things. So it has to do with ambition, or we can say passion. It's our motivator. Mars gives motivation. It has lust to it. It has hunger and drive. Mars signifies bravery, because bravery is the courage and the confidence to go ahead and try, to take a risk, to get something started. And finally, Mars represents command. So Mars is a decisive planet that tells things what direction to go. Therefore, it's kind of dominant and commanding. Now, what we need to do to understand what Mars in the fifth house represents in theory is pretty simple. All we have to do is compare what Mars represents with what the fifth house represents. Mars represents conflict, but the fifth house represents compassion. Compassion means you're feeling what other people feel and you make your behavior accordingly. What conflict means, you're not feeling what other people feel, you're feeling what you feel. So that's one aspect of what's going on between Mars and the fifth house that will form a seed of how we would interpret Mars in the fifth house. And exactly how that seed will grow depends upon the soil that it's in. Another thing about Mars is that it's the planet of individuality, but the fifth house is the house of children. So how is this on the same page at all? Well, individuality means me and the self is the primary importance, whereas children means the group, the family, becomes equally important as I or more important as I. So this is really a conflict between Mars being self-oriented and the fifth house being oriented towards others. Finally, Mars is very commanding and decisive, and the fifth house is very intelligent. So these are the three seeds of what Mars means in the fifth house. Seeds grow differently depending on what soil they're in and how they're taken care of. Similarly, these three things will manifest differently depending on the chart that they're in and how Mars is affected by other planets, etc. Let's take a look at how these seeds would grow if they're just taken care of in a sort of neutral way. So Mars being the planet of conflict and the fifth house being the house of compassion, this is why we interpret Mars in the fifth house as a person who has what I would call a competitive love. This means that their way of dealing with love is almost as if it's a competition in some sort of sense, or almost as if it is something that has a reward to it other than itself. So they may be self-serving in how they love other people, or they may really want to try hard to get the best partner possible because it's like a contest, and they easily become jealous of their partner and also of other people's relationships. It's kind of negative, right? Maybe it's bad. It can be, but it depends how this seed will grow in the soil of the particular chart that it's in. Another thing that sounds kind of bad about this is that the person is not very sympathetic to others, which means that they kind of shut down their feelings when necessary so that they can just accomplish the task that they need to do. How positive or negative that is, again, depends upon the specific chart. Let's have a look at the second seed about Mars in the fifth house. Mars is self-oriented and the fifth house is oriented towards other people. This is why people with Mars in the fifth house don't like having limitations and restrictions placed on them, especially as a result of the partnerships that they enter. And this is why they don't like to enter partnerships, or they're very selective about who they'll partner with. They want to partner with a person that will definitely give them the space to remain the individual who they are and pursue the ambitions that they have. They tend to not want to have the responsibility of having to take care of kids and raise kids. Or they may have physical limitations on the ability to have kids. And then the third thing about Mars in the fifth is that Mars is very commanding or decisive, and the fifth is very intelligent. So that's why we expect people with Mars in the fifth house to be intelligent and have a quick, decisive way of thinking. And particularly, they can figure out how to get what they want or how to know what they want to know. So they're very good at strategizing and making plans. Now, I've been talking a lot about context, etc. Let's turn the book to that page. Let's bring up some well-known people who have Mars in fifth house and see how these basic seeds permutate in their chart. So 4 people to quickly mention. Walt Disney. Just think about him and how he relates with these ideas. Priyanka Chopra, Candy Bar, and Sri Chaitanya. Now let's take a more careful look at another 4 people. Jim Morrison, kind of classic in terms of competitive love, disliking restrictions and limits, wanting freedom, and being very intellectual. One thing about Jim Morrison's chart is Mars is in Gemini in the 5th house. And so that kind of soil of Gemini would make the intellectual implication of Mars in the 5th grow more luxuriously than the other two implications. But another question is, how come Jim Morrison is seen as like a sex symbol, which means people like his lustiness? Well, in his chart, his Mars is his 10th lord, and it's conjoined to Saturn, which is his 1st lord. So you have a conjunction in the 5th house of the lord of a trine and the lord of a quadrant, which makes Raj Yoga, which means the best combination that you can get. So under those conditions, the same seed, it doesn't grow to be a different flower, but it grows to be a flower that people like, a version of itself that people like. Let's take a look at a few more people. Carl Sagan. His Mars in the 5th house is in Virgo. That makes a lot of sense for an intellectual. And he's a great communicator. That also makes sense with Virgo. And also because his Mars in the 5th house is also in Raja Yoga, by virtue of it forming a house exchange with the 7th. And the 7th has a lot to do with communication, how you interact with other people. But the really interesting thing about Carl Sagan is that he's born within 3 days of another very famous person with Mars in the 5th house, Charles Manson. And so their charts look almost exactly the same because they happen to have the same rising sign as well. So this is rather startling, and the only thing that's really obviously different is the position of the moon, which is very, very important in Charles Manson's case, because his moon is not just somewhere else other than where Sagan's is. His moon is exactly conjoined Rahu, which makes him extremely mentally unstable and rebellious. That does go a long way towards describing the difference between Sagan and Manson, but you really have to look at their Navamshas to be able to tell the difference between them. They're quite different. Carl Sagan's is very dominated by Jupiter and Mercury, and so it's very intellectual in its flavor. Whereas Manson's is Saturnian in nature, and it has Mars across from the moon, adjunct to Ketu and Rahu. So it's very violent. And that does really furnish the complete description of the difference between both of these expert thinkers and strategists. But one is quite antisocial and violent, and the other is quite research-oriented. There is one other well-known criminal with Mars in the 5th house, and that's Ted Bundy. It's not that Mars in the 5th house produces criminals, but that sense of disliking restrictions and also having a self-focus in love can be an important part of the recipe that makes somebody move towards criminality. But you see, the soil has to be right. Like in Manson's case, we had to have a very destabilized moon. And in Ted Bundy's case, you have to put it right next to Ketu. You have to put that Mars in the 5th house right next to Ketu, while Ketu is performing a solar eclipse. So hopefully this clarifies how important it is to take into account the whole chart when you're trying to see what Mars in the 5th house or any planet in any house actually means to you. Also, please take care that you're calculating Mars in the 5th house in the traditional manner, which means use tropical zodiac signs and use a whole sign house system, not a dynamic system. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.